Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. I thought we would go live and see what's going on with the Cryptoverse here. Let me just try to get everything set up. All right, so I need to share my screen before I forget. Sometimes there have been times where I've rambled for like 45 minutes and I didn't even share my screen. And then I didn't realize it because I didn't read the comments until half an hour in or something. Okay. Okay. Here we go. All right. All right. I think we're good to go now. All right. So Bitcoin is just above the 2024 high. Now, I've been clear with you guys. I actually just recorded a video and I was about to release it, and I was just like, we'll just do it live, you know? I don't know why I didn't just release the video instead of doing it live, but maybe I'll still release it. Bitcoin is approaching the 2024 high. Now, if you followed what I've said here for the last few months, essentially what we talked about was this, right? Expect a correction after January 20th. Why did we say that? Well, for a few reasons. One was we're pricing in perfection, right? You're essentially pricing in a strategic Bitcoin reserve and deregulation, and Gary Gensler resigning, and you're pricing in perfection. And so when that happens and perfection does not immediately manifest itself, you get a correction, right? Now, if we're being honest, this is not a normal correction for Bitcoin, mainly because, well, it is for Bitcoin, but it's not normal in the sense that it's being accompanied by the S&P getting annihilated. You could even argue that Bitcoin at 75K isn't really that bad compared to where the S&P is, you know? But with that said, I think it made sense to assume we were going to get a correction from here. Now, with it being the post-halving year, we have to talk about, where are we in the cycle? Like, where are we in this market cycle? What does the future hold? What's the optimistic view? What's the pessimistic view? What would help us identify which view will prevail? As I told you guys a few days ago, my base case was that we would likely at least test the 2024 high. And the reason I said that was because of the idea of pricing in perfection. But I mean, we did the same thing in 2017. We tested the 2016 high. The main difference between 2017 and today is that the drop occurred a lot quicker. And it also stayed above the bull market support band, which is not what it's doing right now. But the similarity is that this was about a 34 to 35% drop. And if you look at Bitcoin right now, we're about at a 32% drop, right? So it's not the same thing exactly. This drop occurred in January in 2017, and this drop has basically lasted for part of January, February, March, and now we're about midway through April. One of the things that I think will dictate the rest of this cycle. Now, I'm going to say something that is not a really smart thing to say, okay? And the reason I'm going to say it is because in my mind, I'm going to be thinking like this. All right? But I'm going to say it even though I know that operating deterministically is not a great thing to do. It works out sometimes, right? Like there's times where I've been deterministic about something, like Bitcoin dominance going up, right? And that's worked out really well. And all Bitcoin pairs going down, right? And that's worked out really well. And ETH USD going home, right? And here we are. I mean, ETH just went to 1384, right? 1384. So sometimes being deterministic actually works out quite well, right? Because then you can look back and say, all right, well, technically the view is right. Just because other people didn't agree with it doesn't mean it was wrong to have that view. But there are other times where being deterministic doesn't really work out that well. And I'll give you an example of a time where I operated deterministically and I regretted it in 2023, right? In 2023, I thought there was a good chance that Bitcoin would not break through that. I thought we would spend more time below the bull market support band. I essentially thought that Bitcoin would not pass 35K until 2024, right? I thought that 35K was essentially the ceiling for 2023, but you can see that it actually made it up to 35K in November, and then by December, it was already in the 40s, right? So sometimes acting deterministically can be very detrimental because you can be convinced about something, but the market doesn't care what you're convinced about. The market's going to do what the market's going to do. But I'm just trying to be honest. Like some of the views I talk about, they pan out, other ones don't. I'm just saying that there's likely going to be, at some point later on in Q2, likely extending into Q3, there's likely going to be, at the very least, a counter trend rally. Okay. The success of said rally, I think, depends on what happens like today, right? Like this week, maybe even today, and the next, until all this tariff stuff is over with. At least the market's worrying about it. And the reason why I say that is because while Bitcoin has lost the bull market support band, it has lost it before and was able to regain it. Although when it lost it, it was in Q3, not Q1 and early Q2. But I think you could argue that as long as we don't go too far, as long as we're above the 2024 high, the structure of the market is still theoretically intact. And what I mean by that is just investor confidence could still be rekindled, like it could still be rekindled as long as Bitcoin stays really in the 70K range. I would go as far to argue that Bitcoin could wick to 69K, but as long as it's just a wick, the market could ignore it. In 2017, when the market tested the 2016 high, technically it went about 4 to 5% below the 2016 high. If you look at 2025 or 2024, right, and you look right here, 4 to 5% below that high puts you right around that 69 to 70K level, which is exactly the 2021 high. And by the way, that level is also a level currently being tested by the NASDAQ, right? If you look at the NASDAQ, the NASDAQ already is testing and has already wicked below its 2021 high, right? It's already done that. And so that's why it's been on my radar. Now, this is the way that I think it has made sense to navigate this market. If you're just now joining, I'll sort of fill you in. What I thought made the most amount of sense was to de-risk about 30% up here, right? Basically have 30% cash. And the reason why I say that was essentially because of two things: modern portfolio theory, which suggests that about 30% US dollars in terms of a crypto portfolio currently maximizes your Sortino ratio, or risk-adjusted returns. And the reason I prefer the Sortino ratio over the Sharpe ratio is because the Sortino ratio does not punish positive volatility. So about 30%. The reason I thought 30 as well was because it gives you some flexibility if either we get a deep correction after January 20th and or it's a left translated cycle. Now, we've never had a left translated cycle, but that doesn't mean we'll never have one. Hopefully, this is a right translated cycle. What I mean by that is, normally speaking, the markets for Bitcoin top in Q4 of the post-halving year, right? We've seen that happen many times. Occasionally, though, you get left translated cycles. We haven't seen it with Bitcoin yet, though. Like, that's not something we've seen with Bitcoin, and so a lot of people think it's not really possible. But when you have inflation and unemployment not well behaved, it can happen in the stock market, right? If you look at the stock market and you go back to the 1970s, you'll get an example where the first move here was a right translated cycle where the market went up for 3 years and dropped for 1. But the next cycle was a left translated cycle where the market went up for 2 years and then dropped for 2 years, where the top occurred right around the change in administration, right? When we had a new presidential administration, that's around where the top occurred. Now, there's no guarantee that it plays out like that. There are reasons to believe it's not the 1970s, especially considering that back then, when we got the left translated peak, it occurred during a time when the unemployment rate was actually going down and inflation was skyrocketing. Now, we're not seeing that today. We're seeing what we've seen inflation coming down, and we've seen the unemployment rate slowly going up. Now, the Fed did cut rates, and it's not clear how long it's going to take for that sort of filter through to the economy, and they're probably also sufficiently restrictive right now. I'm not really sure exactly where R star is, sort of the neutral rate, theoretical neutral rate. But that was what I thought, right? Like, I was like, about 1/3 kind of makes sense. Or about 1/3. And then from this point, it really depends on how low Bitcoin goes, is what I think. Okay. And this is what I would say. Let me get like a rectangle here, because I don't want to just draw a line, because as we saw in 2017, it could wick below the prior high and still be technically intact. If we look at a rectangle here and we just take it from, say, like 70, the prior high, all the way down to, let's say, a wick below the 2021 high, right? You could argue that if Bitcoin finds support in here, then the structure of the market is still theoretically intact. Even though it's scary, right? Even though it's scary, you could make the argument. It's not like there's no evidence that something like that could happen. Right? There's some. One of the pieces of evidence for it could be looking at the S&P 500 divided by M2, and actually noting that this current level that the S&P just got a very swift rejection from is the same level that it got a swift rejection from back in 1998, right? Right here. It got a very quick collapse down. And then we went even higher when accounting for the money supply. So it's not like there's no evidence that that could happen, right? There's some. There's some. So if Bitcoin finds support in here, then I think the market is still, the structure of the market is still intact. That's what I think. If it doesn't, and we go to the low 60s, if we go down here, I think you would get a rally either way, right? I think you would, whether it's here and then up, or whether it's here and then up. I think there's a really good chance, I would argue. There's no such thing as a sure thing, right? I mean, it's possible it just drops here and then just keeps on going, right? But these seem to be like the two most likely outcomes, right? I would argue, in terms of probabilities, that if it goes all the way down to the 60s, there's a much higher chance that any rally on the other side of that would just simply be a macro lower high. Okay? Now, I know that sounds scary, but it is what it is, right? I don't control what it is. I would just say that if it goes down there, you would likely get a rally that might even go as late as August. But my assumption would be that it would be a macro lower high. If instead Bitcoin finds support in here, then I think there's still hope, right? The reason why I'm telling you this now is because whatever happens in the next week or two will likely dictate my bias for the next few months. If we go into the low 60s, I'll probably call for a counter trend rally, but my assumption would be that it would resolve to a lower high. If it just stops here and then bounces, there's still a good chance it could go to a higher high, right? So as an investor, I don't know which of these two things is going to happen. Like, I don't know. I do know that there's plenty of examples in the past where the S&P drops, even in some recessions, and it's just a 20% drop, right? Like here, 20% drop. We had a recession. That was the 1991 recession. We've actually made a lot of comparisons with Ethereum to the 1991 recession and noting the similarities. And there's other recessions, right, where you have 20% drops. Right, here's an example of a recession in 1980. We had a 20% drop, and then we had another rally, and then we had another recession. Right, fun times, right, fun times. So the reason why I bring the S&P up is because in order for Bitcoin to have a chance at all to bottom in that range, then the S&P can't keep going down, right? Like if the S&P keeps going down, then Bitcoin's going to go down too. Do you guys remember a week ago when everyone was talking about how Bitcoin was no longer correlated to the S&P? And I put out a tweet and I put out a long video saying, don't fall for that. I've seen it happen many times before where people will say that, right? They'll say that it's uncorrelated. And then what happens is then like the next week, Bitcoin dumps. And obviously a lot of people didn't like that, but now you see why I say it, right? It's not because I wanted it to happen. It was just because like, that's what happens a lot of times. Like, I don't know why. I don't know exactly why Bitcoin holds on longer. And there's a lot of reasons I'm sure we could come up with, but sometimes it holds on longer. It gives people a false sense of security. They pile into Bitcoin because they say it's like a risk-off asset, and then it drops too. So you have to be careful when you chase those narratives. You also have to be careful chasing all the alt season narratives that a lot of people have been shilling for the last few years. But these two scenarios are what I would consider to be the two most likely scenarios. Those two. The two most likely. Either support really soon and then a bounce, or a quick drop all the way to the low 60s. The reason why I say that, you know, and by the way, I mean, with Ethereum, if I were to just look at the Ethereum chart and I had no knowledge of what was going on with Bitcoin, like it is getting really low into the regression band, right? Like I'm not like just ignoring that. It is getting really low into it. It's not just like it's not at the top part of the band. It's not even at the fair value. Well, the quote unquote fair value. It's below it, right? I mean, it went all the way to 1384. Now, what's interesting about that is that back over here, Ethereum. So what I think has been going on is that this cycle has been a 10x of what happened right here for Ethereum. It's just a 10x. Now you might not understand that view, and I kind of agree with you. It's a bit hand wavy, but if we look at a price label here, 80 bucks, 800, 100 bucks, 1,000, 150, 1,500. Breaks down 220 here. It was a little higher, 2,600. To me, this looks a lot like a 10x difference, right? Doesn't it? Now I maybe need to go get my eyes checked. It's a possibility. But it looks a lot to me like a 10x move, right? Ethereum's going through the same structure that it went through in 2019, but the reason why the cycle feels so different is because it has taken place over a much longer period of time. But there's a reason why it's taken place over a much longer period of time, and the reason is because quantitative tightening has lasted a lot longer. Remember, last cycle, QT ended in the pre-halving year. We're now not that far away from being halfway through the post-halving year, and QT still hasn't ended. But it probably will within the next few months. If you read the FOMC minutes, like I'm sure every single one of you have done, you'll see what I'm talking about. I don't even know why I'm showing you guys this, because I'm positive everyone's already read it. But if you go read the FOMC minutes from January, and we look at runoff, read this sentence. In their expectations of Federal Reserve balance sheet policy, survey respondents on average saw the process of runoff concluding by mid-2025, slightly later than they had previously expected. Right? So, what they're saying, at least what I think, is that there's a good chance that quantitative tightening will be over, the average view, by the middle part of the year. Right? By the middle part of the year. Now, that was released when? February 18th? I know it says January 20th, 29th, but that's not when it was released. The minutes were released February 19th. Okay? So that was released before the market crashed. Right? That was released before the market crashed. Do you guys remember back in mid-February when I said two things? I said, first of all, expect a lot of weakness in stocks between February options expiration and March OPEX, right? And then we said because of the tariffs and uncertainty with inflation, we're likely going to see that weakness persist a little bit longer into April, okay? But when the minutes came out for the Fed, this was before the market had collapsed. And back then, they were already suggesting, right? They were already suggesting that they were potentially looking to stop runoff by mid-2025. So, what if they move it up? What if QT ends in May? You know, I don't know. When's the next meeting? Isn't it May something? All right. Next meeting, May 7th. May 7th. All right. Keep that date in mind. Looks like the markets are actually favoring a cut right now. May 7th of 2025 is the next Fed meeting. There's a chance the Fed ends QT in May. Now I want to show you a chart. If you don't have this chart saved on your trading view, then I don't know what you're doing with your life. Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance plus USDC dominance. You got to have it. If you don't have it, you know, just if you don't have room, delete 10 of the meme coins you have tracking on there because they're not going anywhere more than likely. And just add this. Look at this chart. Why is this chart important? Because it represents the flight to safety. It represents the flight to safety. Now, last cycle, the Fed ended QT here, 1 month after it hit the current level that it just hit. 1 month later. 1 month after this. So you see the spike? And then it was just 1 month later, the Fed ended quantitative tightening. So what I'm suggesting is that maybe the Cryptoverse is trying to tell us something, right? Maybe the Cryptoverse is trying to say, hey, Jerome Powell, it's time to end this thing. Because if you look at a date range on when it first hit this level, QT ended 4 weeks later. 4 weeks from this level is the week of May 5th. What's happening on May 5th? The week of May 5th, the next FOMC on May 7th. So what if the Cryptoverse is telling us? Now, there's no guarantee that it'll happen in May. It's always possible that this gets a correction and then it goes back up a little bit later, and maybe they don't change it until June or July. What I'm saying is my expectation right now, given the state of the market, is that QT will end in either May, June, or July. That's my guess right now. That's my guess, is that it'll end in May, June, or July. And I think it's somewhat based on the collapse in the markets, but also if you look at Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance plus USDC dominance, maybe it's trying to tell us something, right? Now, Ethereum has seen better days, right? It's seen better days. And, you know, it's weird because, like, I felt like in my mind, I knew this was always going to happen, right? Like in my mind, I was convinced. I was acting deterministic about it. It's possible I could have been 100% wrong, right? It's possible, but it's happening. And it's always somewhat abstract, right? It's like, it's easy to talk about ETH going home. I'd be like, oh yeah, like it's going to go home. But then when it actually does it kind of sucks, you know? Like, even though, like, I was wanting for it to happen. Like I was wanting for this to happen. This was like one of the main thesis that I had this cycle, was that this was going to happen. And even though I was on the right side of it, it still just feels kind of bad, you know, like it feels like what's going on? Is it dying? Is it not? And it brings back some of the memories that I've had of Ethereum back in 2019 and 2016, where it just felt like it was just gonna bleed forever, you know? And then it didn't, right? It ultimately found support, and we carried on with our lives, and you know, things changed and the narrative changed. My point is that if you look at some of these metrics, you could argue the cyclical nature of the cryptoverse. If you look at ETH dominance, it's getting pretty close to where it bottomed out in 2019. If you look at ETH Bitcoin weekly RSI, it's getting pretty close to repeating the same pattern that it did last cycle, where it tagged this trend line 3 times. And on the third tag of the trend line, ETH Bitcoin finally bottomed when QT ended. And if you look at it this cycle, it looks like it's about to tag that trend line for the third time, right around the time potentially that quantitative tightening might end. So it seems like things are kind of lining up in that regard. I know the price action sucks, and I know that. And I was hoping for this. I mean, I was. But now that it's happening, you know, like, I don't want to see people lose money. Like, I'd rather, like, sometimes I wish I had been wrong about this. Like, there's part of me that, like, is glad that I was right, because I can at least stop worrying about it anymore. And maybe I'll stop losing some hair for a little while worrying about it. But I also don't really like seeing people, you know, hurt and lose money because they really believed in the narratives and whatnot. But this pattern is a pattern that we've talked about and we identified a while back, and it looks kind of like what happened in the recession in 1990, you know, with the S&P, where you had this like triple top and then you had lower lows, and it was basically the final tag of this trend line in the recession that marked the bottom for the S&P, and that was the recession. Now, look, there's a big part of me that thinks that we're going to have a recession in 2026 after the market, you know, has spent time at some lower levels, and you know, it's just going to be undeniable by that point that it's happening. But there's also a non-negligible part of me that wonders, what if it's just happening now and like everyone's ignoring it? I mean, even Atlanta Fed GDP is predicting negative 2.8% for Q1. So like, what if it's just happening now and we're in the recession now? Again, it's not like, I don't want to say it's my base case per se, but there's no denying the similarities between, you know, ETH and the S&P all those years ago. And again, it was the third tag of the trend line that marked the bottom. Now, I don't know how you want to draw this trend line, whether you want to sort of draw it like this. If you draw it like that, you could say it's testing it right now. If you draw it a little bit more in a liberal fashion, you could say it would have to go all the way down to like 1100 or so before it tested, or the lower part of the logarithmic regression trend line. Right? That'd be, you know, around 1100. Now, I don't know if it's going to go that low. What I'm saying though is that, like, as bad as this feels, look at what the S&P 500 did back in 1990, and look at a bar pattern here. Right? Look at this bar pattern on the S&P. We're going to copy that and we're going to paste it over here with Ethereum, and you'll see kind of like what I'm talking about. Right? We talked about this before, but you'll see, you know, the same pattern, right? A very similar pattern play out. And ultimately what happened is the market, you know, and maybe I need to move this over some. But ultimately, you know, the market did something like that, right? Where it had a triple top, had your first low, and then a rally, and then another low, and then a rally, and then the final low, and then the rally. But then the next rally actually led to new all-time highs. The hard part is knowing where the low is. Unfortunately, I don't know. And I don't really, I don't really know how low it's going to go. I know that if it does follow, some of the prior cycles, it always could go lower. But it is something to really think about here, right? Like 1100, 1200, 1300, 1400, 1500. I mean, you could argue if you believe in the regression band, which, I mean, I'm not going to blame you if you don't. But you could argue that if you believe in it, Ethereum is below the fair value right now, meaning it's undervalued, right? Now, I know a lot of people are going to scoff at that idea and just say it's going to zero, and maybe they're right. A lot of my analysis on Ethereum sort of hinges on it not being a relic. If it's a relic, then I'm just wasting my time. I'm just being honest, right? And by the way, if Ethereum is a relic, imagine how many Bitcoin maxis will be made. But that is at least something to consider. And also, if you look at the Ethereum risk metric, it's doing what it did in 2016 and 2019, right? Where it went to the 0.3 to 0.4 risk band, right? It did it in 2016 and it did it in 2019, and it's doing it right now. And every time it does it, it feels really bad. And you know what it took to get down here? An outright collapse by the stock market, right? An outright collapse. It took the stock market dropping 20% to get Ethereum to go home. I mean, to some degree, it shows that Ethereum is holding up better this cycle than it did last cycle, because last cycle, Ethereum went home even when the S&P was going up. So you could argue that, relatively speaking, it's been stronger than it was last cycle. Maybe it's because of the ETFs. Maybe it's more correlated to the stock market today than it was back then. But I think you could argue that, this is the fair value. The fair value being around 1600, and now we're at 1400. Yes, history suggests it could go lower, but honestly, trying to time bottoms, I think, is a fool's errand. If you think it's just going to zero, then I'm not gonna try to convince you otherwise, because there's a chance you're right. But I mean, generally speaking, for assets that you believe in long term, DCA is the way to go. We did a video called The Butterfly Effect. If you guys haven't watched that, just go to my YouTube channel and search it. Basically, it looks something like this, where you have your C is the 0.886, right? And then your final point over here is a new high. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen. But that's sort of the butterfly effect. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's this harmonic. It's this, right? It's that. Now, it's possible that you hit D and then it goes to new low, which would kind of suck. But there's a possibility that this is what's playing out on a really large scale. Right? Where the C point is the 0.886, or as low as the 0.886, which is just a couple $100 lower than the current price, right? It's not that much lower, right? As if you're using this analysis to base your future investment decisions on, it's kind of silly to try to time the bottom, but something to think about. A rally like this for Ethereum would probably depend on Bitcoin not going too much lower. Now, what I'd like to do is look again at what happened in 2021 with the death cross, okay? Because we're going lower now after the death cross, which also occurred in 2021, and I just want to take a look at that really quick. because the pattern is kind of similar. You have a death cross, and then the next day you have a small green candle and a long wick down. Okay? Now look at today, or look at this instance. You have a death cross in the post-halving year, and the very next day you have a small green candle with a long wick down, right? The next candle after that one was a large red candle down. Okay, now look at that. Look at it today. The next candle after that green candle was a long red candle down. And then the next candle back then was then a wick all the way down here. Right? A wick down. Right? So it went from like 31K and it dropped about 9% or so. A wick down. So a 9% drop would put Bitcoin all the way at around 69K. Which, if it just bottoms there, I think the market structure is still intact. And it's still possible that you have a right translated cycle and we all just walk off into the sunset singing songs. If it goes too much below that, I would have my doubts. So watch what happens here. Mid-April is an important time. I've said that many times. Mid-April. A lot of times you'll get, not all the time, so don't hold me to this, but a lot of times you'll get counter trend rallies that start in like mid-April. Let me give you an example. If you look at the QQQ launch in 1999, the reason we looked at this is because we noted a long time ago there's some similarities. In fact, so far the QQQ back then topped exactly 54 weeks after the ETF launch. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we did talk about this literally over a year ago. Bitcoin topped so far exactly 54 weeks after the ETF launched, right? 54 weeks, okay? But back then, the QQQ had a big drop, and then it bottomed the week of, you guessed it, April 10th, right? Mid-April. And then there was this counter trend rally that topped out in like August, September. If this is what is in our future, then it means the current drawdown that we're in right now would probably need to go to the low 60s, just like it did back then, right? The low 60s. And by the way, the low 60s is just tagging this trend line. Right? That would be the low 60s. So if it goes down there, you would likely get a big multi-month counter trend rally into Q3, and then that could be it, right? If it holds support up here and kind of does what it did in 2021, where it just goes a little bit lower from here a couple days after the death cross, then the structure of the market's still there. Those are my general thoughts right now, you know, with regards to the markets. I wish I knew what was going to happen, but I don't. Some crazy stuff. If you look at like the Russell, it's basically given back all of its gains for the entire bull market. Think about that for a second. The Russell is back to where it was in June of 2022. I mean, think about that. Like Ethereum right now is back to where it was in June of 2022 at one point. I mean, it obviously went lower, but you know, the price of ETH is the same as it was in June of 2022. It's kind of crazy when you think about it, right? I mean, when you think about why this cycle has been different. And I'd like to think that we did a pretty good job on this channel of identifying the differences, especially through the lens of things like the Advanced Decline Index of the top 100 cryptocurrencies, and just noting it's been in a downtrend since 2021 began, or sorry, since the end of 2021, just like it was in a downtrend over here. And last cycle, it didn't start going back up until after several more, you know, until higher, you know, more rate cuts as a percentage of the terminal rate. and after the end of quantitative tightening. It didn't start going up until after all that stuff. So that's why the cycle feels different, is because monetary policy is different at this point in the cycle than it was in the last cycle. Last cycle, you could throw a dart at a board full of altcoins and buy that altcoin. There's a good chance it was going to be up 3 months later. This cycle, you do the same thing. There's a good chance the alt will be down 3 months later, not up. The reason is because we never left this stage of the cycle. We never left it. There's a chance that we might leave that stage of the cycle in the coming months. Hopefully, it's not too late for it to be a right translated cycle. And maybe it'll give us some time, to enjoy the other side of the cycle. But again, if you operate deterministically and assume that 2026 is a bear market, then, we're running out of time, right? We only got about 7 to 8 months left before the bear market year. If it's a left translated cycle, then this year and next year are bear market years. So you have to be careful. Also, with regards to investing in crypto, if you're only going to hold one crypto, I think it should be Bitcoin. And the reason is because it's by far the safest. It's not as risky as the other ones. And because I still think Bitcoin dominance is going to go up a little bit more. Not a lot more. Not a lot more. A little bit more. I'm looking for 66%. That's what I'm looking for. Let's see 66%. Where the market cap of Bitcoin is essentially 2/3 of the Cryptoverse. Sounds about right. Sounds about right. And the way I think it gets there is by all Bitcoin pairs going to their range lows. Right? That's how I think it gets there. So anyways, those are my thoughts. We'll see what happens tomorrow. And we'll see where Bitcoin finds support. Whenever we have a resolution to this, we can move on with our lives. I'll probably operate deterministically once we have an answer. That doesn't mean that you should, but I probably will. We should get our answer soon. Someone says, so this is the first time we haven't had an alt season during a bull market. Well, one thing that's important to consider is that in the 2016-2017 bull market, alt season didn't really start until November of 2017, right? It's just that everyone this cycle just thinks of what happened in 2021. And they're like, oh, well, alt season was at the beginning of the post-halving year. But in 2017, it wasn't until the end of the post-halving year. So there's always a chance, right? There's always a chance this still happens. But I think you need to see all Bitcoin pairs lower before it's a realistic chance. Someone says we had alt season on some alts. So I think, as an industry, we've probably come to a collective agreement on what even alt season is. For me, alt season is when Bitcoin dominance is collapsing, right? Like if we look at like this, like that's alt season and that's alt season. But this here, that's not alt season, right? That's Bitcoin season, right? We've been in Bitcoin season. Yes, you can cherry pick a few altcoins and say that those alts had alt season, but that's not what alt season is, right? Like alt season is when like basically all alts go up against Bitcoin, or at least the ones that are still alive, right? So that is alt season and that is alt season, but this is Bitcoin season and this is Bitcoin season. Rick says, sorry to hear about everyone else's alts. That's right. I'm not talking about your alt. I'm talking about everyone else's. This is a good question. What are your thoughts on the 10-year Treasury yield above 4% while the markets are crashing? It's a good question. I honestly think they're trying to crash the markets to get yields down, but the 10-year yield is basically not doing what they want. I mean, it just skyrocketed back up, and it's hard to say if this is just a fake out. But the 10-year yield is up 9% almost this week. Now, you probably shouldn't do percentages on percentages, but it is up, what, like 40 basis points, 50 basis points in a single week. Like, that's a big move by the 10-year yield. And this is while markets are crashing. So who knows what's going to happen there? Because, I think they want to get it down, but it's not going down. It's not going down so far this week. I mean, it's gone up a lot. And not even just in a week. I mean, you're talking about over 2 days, it went up that much. You don't get moves that often that are that big with treasuries. Now, I guess the question is it just like a back test, right? Is it like a back test of this? And maybe that's the answer, right? Maybe we're overcomplicating this and we're making it into something that it's not, right? Like, people are saying, like, what do you make of it? But what if it's just, sort of a retest and then it goes lower? It's a possibility. By the way, guys, make sure you subscribe and give the video a thumbs up. I'm absolutely positive everyone. So we got over 5,000 people watching, not even 1,000 likes. That's about 20%. That's less than where all Bitcoin pairs should be, because all Bitcoin pairs should be at 0.25. We're not even at 0.2 on the like to viewer ratio. Do I think alt season can happen without the social risk going to higher levels? No. I mean, I think in order to get alts outperforming Bitcoin, you need the social risk going up, right? And it's just not going up right now, right? You have to have this going up. You have to have people interested again. Who blinks first, the government or the Fed? That's a good question. I don't know, but I mean, we sure as hell are going to find out. Any other questions here? This is a good question. Why is ETH underperforming other alts? You guys want to see a scary looking chart? Look at this chart. You know how we often look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin? That's this chart, right? This is what we look at often. I want to show you a crazy chart. Same chart, but instead of against Bitcoin, we're going to look at it against ETH. Look at this. Look at this. Altcoins have been absolutely decimating Ethereum. But what if alts are oscillators against ETH? And right now, they just happen to be approaching the range highs. It's a possibility. It's a possibility. How much pain do you think Powell needs to see in order to NQT? Bitcoin is so close to the last line of defense. I I think it's possible that they've already seen what they needed to, and there's a chance they're just going to end it in May. There's a chance. I don't want to like promise you that because in the last meeting minutes they said the average view is like mid year, which is probably not May, but that was before the market crashed 21%. So maybe they're going to move that up. Do I think Solana is in the process of going home like ETH? I think the Sol Bitcoin pair is basically lagging the ETH Bitcoin pair by like 2.5 years. That's my base case. It actually looks like it's just breaking down over here. Looks a lot like what ETH Bitcoin did. Is there a chance dominance doesn't go down? There's always a chance. I think the scary way to look at the chart is some people sort of look at it like this, where you get sort of an initial drop and then a longer drop, and then it just keeps going up far longer than anyone thinks. Do I see an emergency rate cut if the market crashes another 20%? Well, yeah, if it crashes another 20, it's possible. If it just stays where it's at, they're probably not going to get an emergency rate cut. Someone says that Powell will bend the knee. I don't know. We'll see. I was out of town, but I heard that he made some comments suggesting that he wasn't going to bend the knee. Have I seen the Trueflation pointing to a sharp decline in inflation since February? There's a chart of inflation expectations that's been skyrocketing recently. But if you look at a lot of the prior times when it skyrocketed like now, investors were off base completely. So there might even be a higher chance of the markets crashing because of deflation than a secondary wave of inflation. If like because of the wealth effect, right? I mean, the markets are crashing. Um, if everyone's portfolio is down, if they're in stocks, let's say down 20%. If you're in crypto, 50%. If you're in meme coins, 99%. That's the wealth effect, right? The people that are in that stuff, they don't have as much money. They're not going to spend as much money, and that's going to reduce demand, which is going to it's going to hit like the ability for these companies to just keep raising prices. You can implement tariffs, but what if the consumer revolts and says no, they're not going to pay it? Yeah, I know that trueflation is a separate indicator than the Michigan inflation expectations. What I'm saying is that you have the inflation expectations skyrocketing, but you have trueflation showing inflation going down. So, on one hand, there's data that suggests that inflation's going down, but then on the other hand, there's people thinking that inflation's going to go up. I thought that inflation was just going to keep going down, but I don't know how these tariffs are going to affect things. Like I really don't, and I'm not really sure. Like people always want to know my answer to certain things. Like I don't have an answer for that. I had an answer that inflation was going to go down, but with tariffs, I really don't know exactly how that's going to affect the data and how durable it will be. there's always a chance they roll back some of these tariffs in a few weeks as well. Like, I don't know how lasting of an effect it's going to be. Someone, McDonald's Staffing Solutions says, we're here to save the day. Apply now and start your career today. Limited positions available. Um, what are the probabilities that ETH never really makes a comeback? Um, I don't know. Like, it's always been in the back of my mind that like it could be a relic, but I'm not like I don't really think of it as like my base case right now. Maybe it should be, but it's not. My base case is that it will find support, hopefully somewhere in the regression band, and then try to build out a base from there. Make sure again you guys subscribe and give the video a thumbs up if you haven't already. It is actually getting pretty late, so I need to get going. I need to do we do an ITC premium video on Tuesday night, so I got to go do that. But I will leave you guys to it. We'll see what happens in the markets. Stay safe out there. Make sure you're responsible. Obviously, nothing I say is financial advice. Just try to come up with a plan and stick to it, and go live your life. Enjoy life. There's a lot more to life than watching these charts. I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.